So,
All right. Love that.
You are live.
All right. Amazing. Hello, everyone. Hello, world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are so excited to be here with you all for a wide variety of reasons. We have some amazing guests, but I think most importantly, we're actually here together to celebrate Women's Equality Day, which was 100 years ago. And that was a day that celebrates the passage of the 19th Amendment here in the United States, which granted women the right to vote. Unfortunately, though, and we will be talking about this later on, it didn't include Black women. They were enfranchised not until August 6th of 1967. And the women's suffragist movement was successful in large part because of those women too. So we're kind of here to just celebrate, talk about more broadly, some of the opportunities that still exist between true intersectionality of gender equality. And so we have two amazing speakers, and I'm so excited to introduce you to them. So we have Katica Roy, who is the CEO and founder of Pipeline, and an award-winning SaaS company, and then Claudia Reuter, who is Techstars general manager and also the author of Yes, You Can Do This. So we are so excited to have them both. And just a couple of housekeeping items. So we do have a chat, and then we do have an ask a question. So in the chat, feel free to introduce yourself. We'd love to say hello. And if you do have a question throughout the presentation or any comments that you have, there is a specific ask a question box. So feel free to add those in throughout the event, and we will make sure to get to your questions at the end. So I'll kind of turn it over. I'd love to just give you all a deeper dive into our two guests, and I'll let them speak a little bit more about their experiences and kind of why they're here today joining us. So Katica, I will leave it to you. If you can give us an intro, that would be great.
Sure. My name is Katica Roy. As Andrea mentioned, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Pipeline, which is a Techstars alum company. We actually went through the inaugural class of Techstars Impact down in Austin in 2018. My company actually increases the financial performance of companies through closing the intersectional gender equity gap. So gender plus race, ethnicity, and age. Very quickly, we started with research, and we actually did a research study across 4,000 companies in 29 countries. We've collected over 1 billion data points since then. And what we found was that for every 10% increase in gender equity, there's a 1% to 2% increase in revenue. So it's not only the right thing to do or a social issue, but it's in fact a massive economic opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll dive a little bit more into that in a minute. Claudia, do you want to give us a quick intro on who you are and kind of why you're here today?
Sure. I'm so excited to be here today, and I'm excited to dig in more to Katica, what you were just describing, and really get into that. So I'm Claudia Reuter. I'm a general manager, as Andrea mentioned, here at Techstars, and really passionate about the challenges and opportunities that women have in building businesses and in venture in particular. So excited to be part of this conversation and delighted to be able to connect with you both today.
Amazing. Yeah. And I think, just to kind of caveat into some of the questions that we're going to be jumping into, it's a true honor, I think, to be with both of these amazing women that are doing not just kind of advocating for this work, but actually doing the work, which, as we all know, is a lot of the hardest part. So I'll just kind of kick it off. We'll kind of jump into learning a little bit more about your journeys and what you've been doing. So Katica, what inspired you to start your company? If you could give us a little bit more background as to what was the ultimate inspiration and maybe a little bit of the traction that you've had to date.
Sure. And I'll make this fast, but there really are three buckets that inspired me to start Pipeline. One is my family history. The second is watching my sisters and the experiences that they had. And then the third was my experience in the corporate world. So I am the daughter of a refugee and an immigrant. My mom was actually an orphan because of World War II and came to America when she was 21 years old in pursuit of equality. My father actually escaped with my 3 oldest sisters after the fall of the 1956 revolution in Hungary, and they lived in a refugee camp for just under 2 months when President Eisenhower sent Air Force One to bring 21 Hungarian refugees to the United States on Christmas Day, 1956, and they were on that plane. And so for me, being, 3 of us were born here, being the daughter and sister of refugees and understanding that one person made a difference. And that's why I'm sitting here with you today. The second is that there were, we think about the 19th Amendment, which is a really, really important, and there were laws on the books in my lifetime, which I watched my older sisters systemically actually have their economic opportunity muted, if you will. Like the fact that you couldn't get a business loan as a woman without a male cosigner. You could be fired for being pregnant. You couldn't get a credit card with male. I mean, all these things were real in my lifetime, and I watched the impact it had on my sisters and their children. So that was the second. And the third was, I was a poli-sci major undergrad, legal studies emphasis, learned about women's rights. Didn't really think it impacted my opportunities in the corporate world. And after I had my daughter, I came back. I was asked to take on 2 new teams. I was managing a team. It was after my boss was fired. And I didn't get any additional pay for that new team. And my male colleague was a pay grade higher than me and received additional compensation. Mm-hmm. And so I did my research and I went to HR and I said, this is a Lily Ledbetter issue. Every time you pay me, the statute of limitations starts over. What do you want to do about it? And to their credit, they did increase my pay and my level and gave me back pay. But it was really at that moment that I realized that no matter the work that I did and I'd had my education, that my opportunities were not equitable, and that the impact that had was not just an issue of fairness or on me, but the breadwinner for a family of 4, it had an impact on my children's opportunities as well. And so really committed that at that point, if you reported to me, I would do everything in my power to ensure that you were paid equitably and you had equity of opportunity. And that ultimately led me to Pipeline.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, but, kind of a little bit of the history that you gave, like there, even like you mentioned during our prep call, right? There's a lot that still doesn't exist, a lot of equality that doesn't exist, and not even gender, but we can kind of talk about the intersectionality of race as well. But Claudia, what about you? I know you just launched an amazing book. Can you tell us a little bit more about the book and specifically, how that ties into gender equity and kind of some of your experiences and motivations to writing that?
Sure. I mean, as Katica was describing, I think so many of the challenges we often experience as individually, and yet it's really helpful to take a step back and look at how we're all impacted generally sometimes as well. And that helps us, I think, drive towards more change when we can see some of these stats at scale. So I think one of the things that inspired me to write the book was I've had a really interesting and exciting career in that, I was able to start a company. We went through an acquisition. I was able to be at a very senior level in the organization that acquired my company before I joined Techstars. And one day I was really starting to think about, what empowered me or enabled me to have the experience I had really started with entrepreneurship. Because the step back in, I had actually, after I had my first child, who's now 17, I actually stepped out of the workforce for a little while, but not for one clear reason. It was really that the systems and structures in which I found myself didn't feel conducive to having the optimal experience for me professionally or with my family at that point. Especially I think for younger families or people who aren't as far along in their career, the way that childcare is currently set up in the US, doesn't necessarily, your take-home pay sometimes doesn't cover a big, most of it. So the cost of childcare is high. The wage that we provide for childcare providers is barely sometimes meeting poverty standards. So we have a lot of challenges to overcome in terms of, the motherhood penalty. So I started to think, okay, what if I could write a book that just helped people understand that entrepreneurship might be a path forward, not only to like changing and building a business for yourself, but if you can get a business at scale or step into a position of leadership as a result of your business, you actually have the potential to change the stats and change the way work is done. And so I started to do research and work on, some of the other constraints and opportunities that are there. Startups have brought us things like pet-friendly policies and work from home, and so many things we kind of take for granted now as being standard perks and benefits in a lot of progressive companies. And I still think that in many ways, family friendly is not something that we really hear or see a lot of. It's still something that women in particular tend to compartmentalize. And so I'm actually really hopeful in the age of the one hopeful thing, or one of the things in the age of COVID, is maybe we're starting to shine a light on some of the challenges that families have in general, and provide some more opportunities. So wrote a book to help people understand some of the history and challenges, and then give them some tactical ways to start a business and start moving things forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. In entrepreneurship, I think specifically there's always that narrative of, starting something so that it can be yours, so that you can kind of create the world or create a company in the way that you would want it to be. At least I know that's part of the reason why I started the company that I did too. It's like, all right, this world, let's just do it our way. And let's kind of really take into effect like all the things we want to see for not just women, but other people who have otherwise been oppressed. So kind of an open question, and I know there's a lot here. So there's really kind of as an overview, want to be able to cover a couple topics. Like one is specifically around women equality, and feel free to speak to a little bit of the intersectionality that exists there around race. But there's still a lot of inequalities that exist. I think that like you said, Claudia, there's a lot of progress that has happened, which is great. But unfortunately, I still hear women have conversations around, I don't want to mention that I'm thinking about having kids, or that, that I actually deserve higher pay. And so I just want to spend a little bit of time there. Like, I know that, today marks a great day as far as voting rights, but there's still kind of a lot that we can and should be doing. So Katica, maybe I'll open it up to you. Like, what are some of the inequalities that unfortunately still exist today? And, there's a lot, so maybe we can just focus on, we can like focus on
5 minutes left.
I know, right? It's like we need 3 hours to talk about all of them. But maybe, parental leave and childcare, I think, is a big one, right? Like you mentioned, there's a lot of progress that's happening, but that has been traditionally something that's been associated, and whether we like it or not, has held women back. And so I'll open it up to you. Any thoughts on that, and particularly, what progress have we made, and where can we go from here?
Yeah, and I would also encourage people not to lose hope. That we should not, just because things are not as we want them to be, does not mean that they cannot be what we want them to be. They are ultimately changed by people like the three of us and the 22 people who are sitting here listening to us, and you propagate that out into the world, and you can make change. I will answer your question, but it reminds me 4 years ago, and I will answer your question, but I think this is an important piece about hope and understanding where we are, because we don't understand where we are. We don't know what we need to do to fix it and how to make progress. That's why that matters. And 4 years ago, I've got 2 kids. They, at the time, attended, and one of them still does, a school that had a newcomer program. And that newcomer program helped immigrant and refugee children and their families come into the United States. And they attended that school, and my daughter still does, because their aunts, my sisters, were newcomer kids. And that school was tagged with hate graffiti. And so one of the things that I did was to essentially summon all of our elected officials, local, state, federal, et cetera, including President Obama, who was the president at the time. And I received a letter from him, and it was almost 60 years to the day when my father and sisters climbed the stairs of Air Force One to freedom. And one of the things that that President Obama wrote in his letter to me was that history ultimately moves in the direction of inclusion, not because it is inevitable, but because people like the three of us and the 23 people who are listening to this call speak out and stand up. That is what is called upon us to do. That's how progress is made. And so when we look at what's happening today in the workforce, 40% of households in the United States, women are the breadwinners. 71% of households in the US with children under the age of 18, women contribute to the economic well-being of those households. And so when we talk about inequities, whether it's the pay gap or lack of opportunity, it's not just about women. It's about the economy, it's about our current labor force, and it's about our future labor force. And in fact, we've added $2 trillion to the US GDP since 1970 because women increased their labor force participation. And there's another $2 trillion sitting on the other side of that for us. We talk about the motherhood penalty. And what's so interesting about that, you don't even have to talk about wanting children. You can just be of childbearing age, and they will assume that that's what you're going to want to do. And because there's that assumption, what is behind that is that you are less committed to your job because you're a mom. What is interesting is that the data does not vet that out. What the data shows is that the most productive employees over the course of their career are working moms. That if you want to invest in productive employees, you should actually invest in working moms. And that, so it's those things that we need to make progress. I agree about the childcare. I think women's unpaid work has increased something like 157% since COVID-19. And we've had also a number of childcare centers closed down, in addition to the fact that they're not a living wage. We don't invest in childcare as an investment in our future labor force. That's really what it is. It's not like an issue of fairness. And I live this because the first year of my son's life, he's 13, my husband and I both worked, and we were like, I don't think we can afford to have another child because we can't afford childcare. And we were exhausted. Those two things, it was just, and so we are part of that. And yet, if you step back and look at it, we should be providing high quality, affordable childcare as an investment in our country's economic future. That's really what it's about, not just an issue of fairness to predominantly women.
Completely agree. It says because the system as it exists today was built for a different era where there were different rules and different expectations, and we hold a lot of that stuff, I think, still subconsciously, which is why we end up in these unconscious bias situations. But if you think about it, if we have an opportunity if we could just rethink everything right now, right? And we said, hey, we have, equal opportunity for women coming into education. We have, half of college graduates, it's even coming out of college. In fact, I think there's more college graduates who are women at this point. So we should see, look at what's possible across the board and see more policies change, and even really simple things that I think hold people back. And we've talked about this with a lot of different folks, like the idea that the way logistics are structured are not ideal for any working parent, whether it's a man or a woman, right? It doesn't matter. The school day doesn't align with the work day. There's no, to your point, there's no childcare between birth and kindergarten that's usually easily accessible for everyone. And yet we hold a lot of meetings like right at pickup time or right at, so thinking about the whole person and that, how they're bringing themselves to work. And to your point, I think, and it's what I really love about what you just said, Katica, is the idea that the research shows that working moms are more productive. And I feel like just you highlighting that is so important because so much of this is just educating people so that we undo some of the unconscious bias that they've got lingering around there on these topics.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think to your point, right? Like it's not just the smart, it's not the right thing to do. It's also smart for our economy, for our society. I know I have this conversation with my husband all the time. It's like there's just so much that we can contribute, but a lot of times because of these biases that exist, whether there's a lot where I think we as women sometimes don't feel appreciated, right? Or we don't feel valued. And so that kind of ties into like pay, right? I know that we have made progress though. So we are staying hopeful, 100%. But, I know that happens. Like, I know that that's something that definitely happens. But if you flip it on, if we did provide childcare, if we did support those that wanted to get education to further their career, like the progress that we could have in the economy. And more on that, I don't know, Katica, if you have any other thoughts on just not the role that us being inclusive would have on the economy and how just supporting, I think, every worker, right? Especially now when we're talking about essential workers and what it means to be essential, like how can we support everybody in an equitable way so that we can all kind of grow and scale together?
Well, what's interesting, an investment in childcare, whether you look at it as a public-private partnership, right? So for instance, if the government provided some sort of subsidy or whatever that looks like, that's actually not a new idea. We did that in World War II. Because our men were out fighting the war, and we need people in, here to work, and so we did that. Like this is not new. We can do it again, and so some of that history matters as well. How we stay. You asked me how we stay hopeful, and what else we can do. I think there was something something else that you asked me.
I think just in general, like how women and other. Like us, just within the economy and how we can kind of support each other.
Yeah, what's interesting? A couple of things. One is I talked about the $2 trillion that's on the table for increasing the U.S. economy. $512 billion of that is closing the gender pay gap. Another 789 of that is increasing labor force participation. And then the remaining is the mix of jobs that they actually sit in. And when we think about the pay gap, actually, if you look at it through the lens of economics, it actually cuts straight through the U.S. economy. So that shows up in things like women are twice as likely to live in poverty than men. We could cut the Social Security savings in retirement. We could close the Social Security savings gap by 1/3 if we close the gender pay gap. That's because most women actually sit under that Social Security cap on salary. That we have a gender jail gap, that we're actually increasing the incarceration rates of women, and that ties directly to the ability to pay bail. There are a number of different things where if you look at the gender pay gap, just the gender pay gap alone, that it's actually holding back the U.S. economy. And it's interesting, one of the things I did was I talked to some of the presidential candidates during the primaries, and I asked them about their commitment to gender mainstreaming, which is essentially the ability to streamline, look at policies through the gender lens. And I think that's particularly relevant in the time of COVID-19, when we've had economic stimulus come into the economy, because none of that has been gender budgeted. And you talk about essential workers. There are millions of people who don't have childcare, who don't have health care, who have to choose between getting a paycheck or taking care of their children. These are choices faced by millions of families. And if we don't take into account what the composition of families are today, we're actually leaving people behind. And it's getting worse. I mean, before COVID-19, we were actually at the largest income inequality since right before the Great Depression. And now we're in a very similar economic situation as we were in the Great Depression. And we're starting to see that hit now because economic stimulus is starting to run out. And so the question for us really is, are we willing to stand up and do something about it? And it really does take entrepreneurship, innovative thinking, impact on public policy, everybody's lived experience at the table, because it matters, whether you're a breadwinner mom or you're a single mom or whatever that looks like.
Well, I think that's such a great point too, because it goes back to the idea that so often, I think women in particular, we compartmentalize, home from work, and there's sort of a badge of honor of not letting people know all the things you're managing behind the scenes. And during COVID, I had an opportunity to talk to a mom who had twins who are 18 months old, a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old who has special needs, living in a 2-bedroom apartment, single mom, primary breadwinner, when everything shut down, including playgrounds, right? Including any opportunity to. And so when you think, I think the more we can shed light on what does it really mean when we say someone had a choice between childcare or parenting, right? Or their job. I mean, like some of these things that I think at a high level are talked about like choices don't feel like choices when someone's experiencing them live. So the more that we can shed a light on what some of these experiences are really looking like for people, the more, and with the data that your organization is bringing to light, I think the more opportunity we'll have to actually drive change at scale.
Yeah, well, and that false narrative that American families have a choice.
Yeah,
40% of U.S. households, mom's the breadwinner. There is no choice for her not to work, because if she doesn't work, no one eats. No one has a roof over their head. Like, they don't have clothing. I mean, those are the basic pieces. And then another 31%, you're talking about a huge economic cut to those families. So it coupled with the fact that just the cost of things, education, healthcare, retirement, all those housing, all of those things have gone up exponentially since the 1960s, which is the paradigm that we often think of in terms of what the American family looks like, but that's not true. And so you almost need to have either a very high earner or 2 working parents in order to just make it.
Yeah, and the ability, and to your point too, like even if you're not a mother, the biases that are out there are still impacting all women, because there's this perception that the motherhood penalty is still there. Like you could become a mother and you could, become unreliable or whatever the concern is. When in reality, we have this huge opportunity to say, hey, we have a dynamic workforce. We have people who are trying to contribute to the workforce. Why aren't we thinking about the whole person, the whole family, and how we put in the right structures to make things actually function? So, the situation of, should I keep my job and my roof over my head, or make sure that the kids are, okay, doesn't really seem like a choice at all. It really doesn't.
Well, I think there's a couple of things in there too. One is that we need to redefine what it means to be a good mom. We have this idea of what it means to be a good mom. And, I love my kids. I would lay down my life for my kids, no question. But I don't take that. I mean, they're doing virtual school. But during non-COVID times, I didn't take my kids to school. I don't make their lunches. I redefine what it means to be a good mom. And that means my kids know how to negotiate. They know what's possible for me. Some of you know that I was named the 2020 Colorado Entrepreneur of the Year, which means that I'm on the cover of a magazine and there's a feature article. My daughter, who's 9, takes that magazine with her to play dates. And she's like, this is my mom, right? So it gives her an idea of what's possible for her. And then also for my husband, for my son, because 48% of working dads would actually like to stay home with their children. That's the other part of this, which is, and if their partners don't have equity of opportunity, assuming it's a heterosexual couple, they can't stay home. And part of the other reason why they don't do that is identity and isolation. So my son also has this idea that he could be a stay-at-home dad, like his dad, or he could go and work. Like there are those opportunities. And so we're showing our children, both boys and girls, a myriad of opportunities of what's actually possible. The other thing about that from a labor force perspective is that women are the most educated cohort in the US. Like we get the majority of all bachelor's degree and higher. And right before COVID, women were actually the majority of all bachelor's degree and higher in the US actually participating in the labor force. So if you wanted to look for the highly educated labor force, women were the ones that you wanted to bet on. So making the accommodations in terms of being your authentic self, bringing your whole self to work, childcare, et cetera, that matters.
Well, and on that, can we go back to the concept of equal pay? Because, to your point about, World War II, women, there were options for childcare because the men were off at war. Women were also the first programmers in that time period.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until it became a male-dominated industry that it became lucrative or highly paid. And same for so many industries, whether it's, delivering babies or programming, it's once it is a job that is more likely to be done or perceived to be done by a man, the pay goes up. So how do we change? What are your thoughts on how do we change that?
How do we change that for everything?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. There's actually some precedent for that. Canada passed a law in 2018, which actually is a Pay Equity Act, where they looked at similar job functions. So for instance, like you could have a parole officer and a social worker, and parole officers are largely men and social workers are largely women. And so to your point, they're actually called pink collar jobs or the pink ghetto. Like I think there's 26 job classifications in the United States where women dominate them. And there's a pretty large gap between the pay of the two. And so what Canada is looking at is actually, how do we compare jobs that are really largely the same, but may have different dominance by gender, and therefore, like the one that's male dominated is paid at a higher rate, and essentially equalize that. So they're actually in the throes of doing that right now and figuring out what does that look like. In addition to and they're like Iceland, to some extent France. Canada is really only the third country in the world to pass a true equal pay law, which takes the burden of responsibility off of the person who's being underpaid to speak up and puts the burden on companies to actually prove that they are paying equitably. And I think that's an interesting move toward what we may see more and more of. I mean, the United States, the equal pay law was signed into law by President Kennedy in 1963, and actually in the U.S. the pay gap has gotten worse in the last 10 years, and so we're now moving backward. And it might seem like a cent or two, but it matters. Like those cents add up to a lot of dollars.
Well, and isn't it true that in some states, I think Massachusetts is one, they stopped, you can no longer ask someone how much they currently make or made. And they've demonstrated that has actually helped close the gap a bit. Do you think that?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm interested in your research on it.
Yeah, so actually, Katie Donovan, who spearheaded that, is actually a friend of mine in Massachusetts. Okay. So it does help to close it, but it doesn't help close it all the way. That's the issue, right? So, and actually Colorado last year passed one of the most comprehensive pay equity laws. I was actually one of the people that testified from an economic perspective on the importance of that, which not only banned the asking about previous pay, which does matter, it's just not the only thing that matters, but also equity of opportunity. One of the things that Pipeline has found through all of its implementations is that, in fact, you can't close the gender pay gap by starting with pay. And the reason is that pay is the symptom, it's not the disease. So in other words, pay is the quantitative value you place on your talent, but the actual value happens before that in performance and potential. And so we found that those to be very important inputs, because that's where you're valuing your talent, to then actually the quantification of that value.
And can you jump into that a little bit more? Like, I think specifically, right, like we're talking, and I just want to clarify, like, is it job descriptions, right? Because I've also heard this other theory of like everybody within the organization should just know everybody's salary. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know that was kind of a trend for years ago?
For a while. Pay transparency, there are some companies, Whole Foods, before it was purchased by Amazon, is an example of one who have had pay transparency up and down the line. It is part of a free market economy. Like, we know the price of bananas, we know the price of apples, wherever we're going to buy them. It's sort of a similar approach from a talent perspective. It won't solve it, but it will help. It will definitely help to have pay transparency. And then there was something else you asked me.
No, I was just thinking too about like you said of some of the, I love the way you said it, right? That the equal pay is not, it's not really the symptom, right? And the symptom in part is also how we measure progress and how we measure performance. Right. And I've been asked this a lot, I think, just through my work, kind of trying to guide founders in diversity, equity, and inclusion of, oh gosh, does that mean also the job description, right? Of the titles. And so I think that's something that I've seen come up in conversations, particularly with women, is, I do the work, my job description clearly qualifies me as something else, but I haven't gotten the recognition. And I'm just curious if either of you have any thoughts on that, on particularly advice for companies that are starting to think about that.
Do you want me to go? I can go. From a titling, I don't want to dominate. From a titling perspective, you mean from a titling perspective?
Yeah, from a titling and job description.
My title doesn't in job description. Well, that's the class action lawsuit that's against Google right now, which is that they systemically underleveled women. And that they were doing the same work, but they were put in a lower level. So that certainly happens. I think we use job descriptions only to find talent in organizations, but we don't use it for anything else in the Pipeline platform. But what we found is that a couple of things. One is that women are judged based on their past performance, not their future potential. So we're more likely to pattern match men into roles over equally or more qualified women. And you can see that particularly through an intersectional lens. There currently are 4 Black CEOs in the Fortune 500. All of them are men. There has only been one female Black CEO in the Fortune 500, which is Ursula Burns of Xerox. So that we should take that, and we've found that the promotion gap for Black women is twice that of women overall. That's what we found in our through our implementations. So there's that piece. There's this talk about applying for jobs, like having, we need to, and it's important to change job descriptions. That's, to make them more inclusive. That's fine. The issue is that we say, oh, well, women will only apply for jobs if they have 100% of the qualifications. Men will apply if they have 60%. That, by the way, was never true, but anyway. And the issue, though, is that we don't tell women the other half of the story, which is the person sitting on the other side of the table from you is using the very same criteria. It's not that I'm not confident. It's that the system has told me that I don't have the same value as someone who's male because I don't match the pattern of who is predominantly the CEOs and senior leadership or those that are in line for CEOs. I mean, in the Fortune 500 right now, women as a total make up about 7% of Fortune 500 CEOs. That is 93% of Fortune 500 CEOs are men. And yet,
let that number sink in.
Yeah, one of the things we talk about is that there are more men named John that run companies than women of any name. And
oh my gosh.
Make up 1.2% of the population, and women make up 51% of the population. That encapsulates that pattern matching that happens and the value.
Well, you jump into the venture scene, and it was 2.8%. I think we're up to 3% now of companies that get funding have female founders, and it's an interesting moment. Your point on the idea that it's the pattern matching that people are having on the other side of the table, I think is so important for people to understand and hear. Like the idea that if you really think about it, if you, even right now, if you, and I've shared this image with people before, if you go onto Google and you search images for CEO, you will only get pictures of typically white men popping up. And it's not because it's searching for a particular person. That's just the algorithm that's like CEO, white guy is what's popping up. And so, but the more we can get images out of people who look different than that in those roles, the more people might stop, like have a different set of pattern matching. Like, and you know, there was an article I read a while ago about that show Ally McBeal that was on in the late 90s, the law show. Like just simply seeing women in positions at law firms increased the number of applicants of, you know, females who are applying to law school. Not directly correlated, but just the idea that simply putting the image out helps you see yourself there and helps others see the potential there. So we need more.
Yeah,
imagery.
It's interesting. You know, what's interesting is if you type Katica Roy in Google, one of the searches is Katica Roy husband. They want to know who my husband is because there's an assumption.
No, I'm like gonna Google it right now.
Like he's like you never find him because he's not online. I mean, like, you know, but like it's interesting that there's an assumption that if you are prominent or well known or whatever, that is that you must be attached to a man who is also is as prominent, if not more prominent than you are.
Yeah.
I'm going to go Google myself.
See what comes up.
Katica Roy husband, Katica Roy network. I can see because when I search, you know, I look for myself and just to see what's out there, and it'll say, and then like it'll show you all the searches that were done. Katica Roy husband, Katica Roy net worth, whatever.
Yeah, no, you're totally right though. It's all the assumptions people bring, that all the baggage people are bringing, whether they know it or not, pops up, and it's really interesting, and that's why I'm so excited about what you're doing with Pipeline. That this idea that, like, you know, Google's algorithm being a good example, the way in which technology is advancing, like we're at risk of baking all these biases right into the software that we're becoming so conditioned to use. So how do we overcome that?
Yeah, and especially with race too, right? I think we haven't touched on that yet, but like that's another one. Like I know how facial recognition doesn't really recognize Black faces. Like why, right? And how come we left those individuals out during that process? But yeah, Katica, go ahead. I know that that's something else that's super important when we talk about both race and ethnicity, and how that if you're a woman, a Black woman in particular, like you're like you were saying with pay equity, it's even lower, and there's way more gaps that need to be addressed.
Yeah, well, and so 2 points. One on the a Black breadwinner mom. So Pipeline actually did a research study a couple of years ago about breadwinner moms through the lens of intersectionality. We were interested in what the breadwinner mom pay gap is. There's the mom pay gap, which I think is 71 cents on the dollar, but breadwinner moms actually as a cohort earn 66 cents on the dollar. Wow. And there's 16 million breadwinner moms, and they support 28 million children. Black breadwinner moms actually have the largest gender pay gap of any cohort of women in the workforce, which is 44 cents on the dollar. And Black breadwinner moms actually support the majority of all Black children, and they have for the last 38 years. They support 8 million children in the United States. And so we need to understand what those gaps are and the impact that has through the lens of intersectionality. As far as advanced technologies and artificial intelligence and being in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution, you know, we have seen facial recognition is certainly an important one. We've also seen the Apple Card last year, which was done with Goldman Sachs, that was biased against women. We saw that with the Amazon hiring AI that they created. And so if you don't have people who are behind the scenes, right, who are because people program these AI, like, it doesn't magically happen. There are programmers. And so if you don't have people, a diverse team that's representative of those different lived experiences, then you will miss out on what are systemic biases against groups of people, whether they're women, women of color, people of color, etc. For instance, like things some people don't know that Black soldiers were redlined from the GI Bill. From some of the benefits of the GI Bill because they were Black. You have to understand some of the racial economic wealth in the the inequalities of racial economic wealth in the United States are not by chance.
Mm-hmm.
They were not by chance. It wasn't because people needed more financial education. It's because they weren't given access to actually build wealth, to buy homes, to get loans. There are systemic ways that we have blocked people from building wealth. That's what we need to think about correcting.
Yeah.
And ultimately, if you look at it through an economic lens, it is more than just an issue of fairness. It's actually an issue of economic opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. And
because,
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just say because you can't choose whether or not you pay for people. You have to choose how you pay for them, and fundamentally, it's about investment and returns. And we need to think about that.
Yeah, and how it ties into the economy, right? It's all intertwined. There's this great quote actually, and I think it kind of encapsulates a lot of what you're saying. And it was written by a Forbes contributor, and I'll find their name in a second. But I'll just read it because I just think it's so powerful and it's very contributing to this. The people creating tech have the power to influence how it works, and that is too big a responsibility for any single demographic to have full control. A lack of diverse ideas and representation could lead to further disparities between gender, race, and class. I just remember reading that when I was actually applying for the role here at Techstars, and it just resonated with me to the point of, yeah, you're right. Like, how did we let this happen? How did we let it get to the point where there isn't representation, where we're seeing a lot of this AI that's making these mistakes? And I know kind of ties into entrepreneurship too, and the existing gaps that currently exist, not just for capital, education, network, talent. But I think, especially since we're all entrepreneurs kind of here today, there's a lot that we could be doing, but it all kind of contributes to the economy. And for entrepreneurs that are listening today, like, what advice would you give them? I know part of it is like standing up, like you talked about being represented and being able to Google things so that we can see more of other people represented. But I just want to open that up and let that quote sink in.
I think there's some great examples of people who are driving change that I like. Sabrina Tucker Barrett, she's leading an organization called Girls for Technology in Hartford, Connecticut. And they went and did pitch competitions at Facebook. They've been to the White House. But the idea that like entrepreneurs can build businesses at scale, but they can also build business that are enabling or empowering businesses, even, at the nonprofit size for other organizations. So, examples like Sabrina is a great one of, she's made a commitment to increasing the number of women, and in particular women of color, in technology. And, she's just been able to accomplish an incredible amount in a short period of time. So I think, there is, obviously, and I'd love Katica's thoughts on this, because I think there's a ton of policy issues too and other things. But I would encourage people, as if you're thinking about starting a company, think about where you can have impact at a much bigger scale than you might be thinking of for simply, the business that you're building today. But how could you potentially change some of these things we're talking about?
Yes. That's why I started Pipeline. It was this idea. I am a former full stack developer, even if I don't look like one, fluent in 4 programming languages. I have that background. The data shows that women are more likely to start for-profit companies that actually have social impact, that we intuitively just put those two together, not as sort of something we think about afterward. And that our lived experiences matter. One of the things that I talked about early when COVID hit and we were all under lockdown and, was like sort of the very beginning, was my real concern, this gap in capital for female entrepreneurs, female founders, as far as I could calculate, is about $11 billion. Based on all the data that I could find. And what we know is that from the 2008 Great Recession is that the companies who increase the velocity of their recovery put equity at the core of their crisis management, right? So to actually make it through the Great Recession. And so we know that we not only need to do that in corporations, but we also need to make sure, particularly in this recession or depression, because it's impacting women. Women have lost the majority of jobs. It is since the 1980s. This is the first recession that has essentially fallen completely. Like every data piece that you look at, women have lost the majority of jobs. They're the majority of the essential workers. They're the majority of the folks taking care of kids at home, et cetera. But that we need women's entrepreneurship ideas to succeed and thrive to help our broader economy recover faster. And so my recommendation is, well, if we're not going to have competition in funding female founders in the open market, then part of the federal government's responsibility is to ensure that we do. So let's close that $11 billion gap and let's make it grants instead of loans. And then women also keep their equity, because we also know that not only do women raise less money, their companies are undervalued. And because they're undervalued, the price of their company when they're actually going to raise money is lower, which means they give up more equity. They give up more equity, they have less control. They have when they actually have a liquidity event, they make less money, which means that there's less money to propagate into an ecosystem into future founders. So my recommendation was, let's create an $11 billion relative to the $8 trillion that has been pumped into the global economy is nothing. And so we should close that gap and ensure that female founders, companies can not only succeed, not only continue to exist through the pandemic, but actually thrive. And that was not only the right thing to do, but it's actually good for our economic recovery.
Yeah, and there's thanks for that. We have about 10 minutes left. It's crazy. I feel like I could talk with both of you for hours, and we probably could if people let us. But I have there's some questions coming in, so I'll kind of open it up to both of you. I'll start with Christine. She asked, "What is the most critical thing we can do to move the dial for women plus, especially as a woman? Also, what advice do you have for allies? I feel like I spend a lot of effort educating my peers about female gaps."
I mean, I think there's tons of things we could be doing, but something that, like one of the things, if we break it down into the micro kind of view for a second, like, at Techstars, even, for example, I think one of the keys is exposure and education. And so like some of the things we're trying to do, even as we work with, one, looking at making sure that we're having recruiting women and sourcing, women-led companies into our accelerators. But then providing, guidance and research, and Andrea, you're in the role you are, in part to help with this, right? On some of the challenges that are maybe not obvious, like, some of the research that's come up on, the different types of questions that women get in investor meetings, with no necessarily bad intent, but the idea is, the studies are showing that women are more likely to get questions that make them talk about risk, and men get more questions about opportunity. And when you're talking about opportunity, it's a lot more exciting, and that's where, more money goes. So we do some coaching on how do you turn that conversation around, acknowledge the question, and yet get back to opportunity. So I don't know that I'd love, Katica, your thoughts on this. I think at a high level, from my view, the critical stuff is getting this information out there. So, because when people know better, they do better. I do believe that. And I think that some of these things, even, Katica, you were bringing up the idea that in the 70s, you couldn't get credit without a male cosigner, you were still discriminated against for pregnancy, potential pregnancy. And even now, I think a lot of women are surprised by that, because you think, oh, the rule changed, therefore everything's changed. And so I think the more we can expose and inform, the more that we'll see people becoming conscious where maybe they weren't conscious before?
Yeah, I also think that, and I'll get to some of the question that they had to. I also, what we also know is we have to change the system so that people, which is what Pipeline does through its platform, so that by default the system is equitable. So rather than people having the option to choose to be equitable, which is what is true now, you have to choose to be inequitable. That's a very different decision. So I think it's good for people to be. I think it's good for people to be more aware. I obviously I do. I write a lot. I speak a lot. I think it's important. Everything I do is through the lens of data, and our philosophy is that the data itself is irrefutable. You can choose whether or not you want to do something about it, but the data is the data. Period. Mm-hmm. Unconscious bias, and I know you're not talking about unconscious bias training, but people tend to go there so I want to address that piece, because what the data shows about unconscious bias training for all the millions, if not billions of dollars that have been spent on unconscious bias training is that it doesn't move the needle. And that in actual fact, it can make it worse. That the research studies have shown that it can make it worse. And what's interesting about the research on AI is that if we can use artificial intelligence to create equitable systems, then we change people's behavior through changing the systems that we're in. That's one of the things where, when we talk about some of the biases in AI, one of the things we've also talked about is who wins in the age of AI, who wins in the fourth industrial revolution. And the truth is, it's up to us. We get to decide right now what that will be, right? And so we have that within our power to change that. I think a couple of things, Roy and Christine had some questions about educating people. That's a consistent and common problem that's echoed, particularly for people who participate in ERPs, affinity groups. There's a push for those to actually be paid because it's like a form of unpaid work at work, unpaid labor at work. I think, the thing that we have always focused on at Pipeline is gender equity not only as a social issue, but as an economic opportunity. And the fact that it's not a zero-sum game. It's not like if women win, men lose. That's not the way, if you look at it through the lens of economics, it's actually, if we move toward equity, it actually provides more economic opportunity for everyone. Most of the companies that we work with, when we evaluate their gaps and we show them what their upside is, and they're mostly, enterprise companies, 10,000 employees or more, their opportunity through closing the equity gap is in the millions. They have millions more revenue that they could actually capture if they move toward equity. When you have more revenue, you have more opportunity for everyone in your company, not just women. You've got more upward mobility. You've got bigger bonuses. Your stock price goes up. That's actually for everyone.
Yeah, and that point of changing behavior, I think, is so crucial, right? Of how do you actually start to change the systems and processes, and that's kind of the hardest part. Those are systemic. So I have another question in here that's getting a couple of votes. How can we increase networking among female founders and female VCs?
Well, I think this is an example, right? Obviously we're in COVID, the time of COVID where networking is a little bit harder because everything's virtual, but at the same time, there's some leveling of the playing field there. We're all able to get on today, even though we're not in the same city. But certainly, at Techstars, we're focused on, community events around the world. We certainly have, a number of startup weeks that have, female founder focus. And, there's a number of other partner ally organizations with Andrea, I'm sure you can go into, including All Raise and others that, are really focused on helping increase the network among women who are trying to move the needle a bit.
Yeah, and there, I'm happy to share resources too after, because there's a lot of great women out there, particularly that are leading these efforts to do precisely that. So I'm happy to share those in the chat too. So we have about 2 minutes left. I'll just see if we can have this one question, something around the topic of hiring. So is removing names from resumes helpful or not? I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
It depends how you define helpful.
Like, does it, I guess, I'm assuming
No.
questions. I was like,
because it may, like, we do know that if you change your name on your resume, I actually so wanted to do this one. I wanted to like use like a man, like do my resume, but put it on LinkedIn as like a man and see what job offers I got and if they were different. But anyway, I never did it, but I so wanted to do it. But we know from the research that gender or unusual names do set you back. The issue is that at some point you will be in that company and people will know your name and they will know what you look like. And so if we don't deal with that piece of it, all we've done is just put people into a system that doesn't value them equitably. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do that. It's just that we should focus on ensuring that the systems that folks are in are equitable themselves. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Pipeline actually focuses on internal hiring or mobility rather than external hiring. And the reason is that the best way to attract diverse talent is to ensure that your existing diverse talent is successful and not just in their current role, but across your entire company. That's what gives me hope that, for instance, the employee experience will sync up to the commitments that companies make around their public commitment to gender equity, to intersectional gender equity, to racial equity, et cetera.
Yeah, no, 100% right. It's like, I love this one analogy that's diversity is being asked to the dance and inclusion is being asked to dance. And I think those are two different, very different, experiences. I know many of you have been to dances, maybe not, I don't know, but you can at least attest to like feeling included and feeling excluded. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. Well, unfortunately, we're right at time. This was an amazing session. Thank you for our panelists for just engaging in this conversation. I know that it's just the beginning, but hopefully we can continue to have these engaging discussions where we can invite other folks to just come and participate. Thank you to the viewers that showed up, whether it was morning, afternoon, night. Just thank you for being here. It's super important to continue to have this dialogue and just learn from each other and stay hopeful, right? Stay hopeful in the fact that we can all create change. So thank you all again for joining. Feel free to connect on LinkedIn. I'm happy to share resources that I have, and I know other two ladies on the call would as well. So
definitely.
So thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.